Hi, this is Eric Keller for Otoy. In this video, we're going to talk about some techniques you can use for creating more realistic plants when rendering with Octane for 3D Studio Max. We're going to look at how you can create translucent effects, as you can see on the leaves and the flowers in this render, as well as some techniques for rendering different materials on either side of a polygon surface. This is the technique I use to create sort of one texture for the top of these leaves and a different texture for the bottom of the leaves. Not only does it help to create a little bit more realism with your plants, it also helps to add a sense of depth and three-dimensionality to the plants in your scene. So let's start by taking a look at the material that I've applied to the flower petals in the scene to create this translucent effect. If I switch over to Photoshop, here's a diagram of the actual material. It's a very straightforward mixed material setup. A mixed material blends two different other types of Octane materials together depending on a particular amount between 0 and 1. So a value of 1 is 100% of one material, or a value of 0 is 100% of the other material, and a value of 0.5 is a 50-50 blend between the two materials. Now I'm using a diffuse and a specular material to create the translucency effect. The diffuse is providing much of the color, and the spec is providing much of the translucency. So there are a number of techniques you can use for creating translucent effects when you're rendering using Octane for 3D Studio Max. For example, you can use a medium node, such as an absorption medium or a scattering medium. However, those only work on surfaces that have thickness to them, surfaces that define a volume. So let's take a look at the geometry of the ivy and the flower plants in 3D Studio Max. Let's switch over to clay shading so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. I'll zoom in on a flower. So if I zoom in on this flower, you can see that the petals are actually just two-dimensional polygons. So they have no thickness to them at all. And the same thing with the leaves of the ivy plant. In fact, the leaves are even more simple. They're just simple polygon squares. So this means that I can't really use a medium node to create the translucent effect. And instead, I'm using a technique where I'm going to create a specular material with a certain amount of roughness to it that creates kind of an effect somewhat like frosted glass. So on my specular material, I'm going to set the index of refraction to 1, and then I'm going to put a light colored texture into the transmission channel and then increase the roughness, and this will create that kind of frosted glass effect. And shadows cast from other leaves on the backside of the plant will come through in the translucency, creating that nice kind of glowing organic effect. So here's a graph of the material that is applied to the flowers in our scene. It's actually pretty straightforward. It's a mixed material, and I have a diffuse material and a specular material. So the diffuse is kind of providing the overall color, and the specular is providing that translucency. And I'm using the same texture maps in both materials. For the mixed material, I'm using a simple value for the amount. So if I move this up or down, that's going to increase or decrease that translucent effect because it's going to be increasing or decreasing the amount of influence that specular material has in the output of the mixed material. So pretty straightforward. If you want to make it even a little bit more interesting, you could put in another texture into the amount, maybe a grayscale texture that shows kind of the details of the veining in the flower petals or something like that. Right now I'm just keeping it nice and simple with just a straightforward amount. For the flower diffuse material, if we take a look at the settings here, I have an image map in the diffuse channel. And it's just a very simple painting of the colors on the flower itself. So got a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red and purple, and of course green for the stem of the flower, and the other bits of the flower up here. So this is being plugged into the diffuse channel of the diffuse material, and it's also being plugged into the transmission channel of the specular material. So if we take a look at the settings for the specular material that is plugged into the mixed material, you'll notice that the reflection is black, meaning that light is not bouncing off of the flower petals, it's going through the flower petals, and the transmission is using that same image that I'm using in the diffuse channel of the diffuse material. And this image, of course, is mostly very light colors, yellows and whites and that kind of thing. A little bit of color here to add some visual interest. But for the most part, the light colors on the flower petals are going to allow more light to pass through the surface. Then I've set the roughness to 0.95, so it's almost 100% rough. So that means it's kind of like a blurred refraction, meaning that light is kind of bouncing around as it passes through the surface. and that's what creates that more of that frosted glass kind of effect. And then I've set the index of refraction to 1 so that there's no refraction. And also if we take a look, I have a image plugged into the bump channel of both the diffuse and the specular. So it's the same bump map plugged into both materials. That also adds a little bit more of the roughness to the refraction on the specular material, which kind of again adds a little bit more visual interest to the translucent quality of the flowers. So now let's take a look at the leaf, which is slightly more complex. So I'm going to hide this diagram here. Let's take a look at the leaf diagram. So the leaf diagram has two mixed materials that are kind of nested. So I have the main mixed material that's applied to the leaf geometry, and I have a specular material that, very much like the flower, is providing us with a nice sort of translucency. Instead of just using the amount slider, I'm using a float image map, but it's a nice way to kind of control or at least show some detail in the translucency. In the Octane plugin for 3D Studio Max, float image map is called grayscale image. So those are the same thing. Float image map and grayscale image, same thing. Now in this mixed material, rather than just having a glossy material, I have another mixed material. And the purpose of this mixed material is to allow me to apply two different materials on either side of the leaf. So here's the actual textures that I scanned that I'm using for my ivy leaves. And you can see I have one color for the top and another color for the bottom. So by using that polygon side Octane texture as the input for my mixed material, I can put all the textures related to the top of the ivy leaf on one side of the polygon and all the textures related to the bottom of the leaf on the other side of the polygon. So here's a graph of the material that is applied to the ivy leaves. It looks fairly complicated, but it's basically using the same principles I outlined in those Photoshop diagrams. It's really just a couple of nested mixed materials. So let's take a look at it close up, node by node. So here is the mixed material that is applied to the ivy leaf geometry. As its inputs, it has a specular material. This is creating that kind of translucent effect. And we also have another mixed material. So this mixed material is going into material 1 of this mixed material. This mixed material is allowing us to apply two different materials on either side of that leaf polygon. Now what's controlling the amount of blending between these two materials is a grayscale texture, and you can see it has kind of it's a high contrast grayscale scan of that leaf. So you can see a little bit of the veins coming in. And the idea here is to add a little bit more visual interest in the mixing between the two other materials. So for our specular material, let's move some of this out of the way here. Most importantly, I have this opacity map. And this is an alpha channel that shows the outline of the leaf, because the leaf in my scene is a polygon square, and the UVs of that polygon square kind of match this image. Really simple UVs, so I'm able to put in this black and white image into the opacity channel of the specular material, which gives the leaf its leaf shape. And you'll notice this same opacity map is also being plugged into the various other materials that are part of this mixed material. We'll get to that in a second. If we take a look at the settings for this specular material, I have again the reflection is set to black. I have kind of a greenish transmission, a high roughness value, and an index of refraction of 1. So those are the most important aspects of this material, along with that texture that's plugged into the opacity. So that's it for the specular material. It's creating that translucency. Now let's take a look at this mixed material. So for this mixed material, let's kind of untangle these a little bit. I have my glossy material that has all the top textures and my glossy material that has all the bottom textures. And then for the amount of this mixed material, I'm using that Octane polygon side texture. And there's not a whole lot of attributes to this particular node. In fact, there's just one called invert. So if I need to flip these, I could just turn on invert and it'll flip it to the other side. So it's really just looking at the normals of that polygon and using the normals to determine which material to put on which side. For the glossy material for the top, I have a bunch of texture maps. So here's my scan of the top of the leaf. That's going into diffuse. I have a specular value of 0.57 because I want it to be nice and shiny. In the roughness, I have a dark version of this scanned image, and because it's more dark and it's plugged into the roughness, that means it's going to be a little bit shinier. So I want the top of the leaf to be shinier than the bottom. So dark roughness texture there. I have a simple bump map plugged into the bump channel. That's not terribly exciting. And then, of course, that same opacity map right here, that leaf shape, is plugged into the opacity of this glossy material. And then for the bottom, it's very similar to the top. It's just a difference in the textures that I'm using. So for the diffuse on the bottom glossy material, I have this image, and I've plugged in a color correction node so that I can dial up or down the brightness of that image, just to really make sure that it looks kind of different from the top. For the specular, I have a low specular value, about 0.2, and then for the roughness, I have a lighter grayscale image than the roughness in the top. So this is going to be a little bit duller than the top. And then, of course, a grayscale image for the bump. And one more time, that same leaf shape alpha is plugged into the opacity of the bottom. And that's pretty much it. That's creating the leaf texture. And it looks complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. It does show the power of using mixed materials and layering them. I could even make this more complex if I wanted to, and you can download the project file for the scene and play with the material and see if you can even increase the realism a bit more. I hope this video has given you some ideas on how you can render more realistic looking plants and leaves in your Octane scenes in 3D Studio Max. And please feel free to download the project files and take a look at them and how they've been set up.